Hey guys, today's lesson's on literary devices for the longest memory in Black Diggers. Now by the end of this lesson, you should be able to examine different scenes and extrapolate the different literary devices used, particularly the ones that we're going to focus on today. And you're also going to be able to compare and contrast the intent behind the use of these by both authors. I also want to make it very clear, guys, that if you're not using literary devices in your essay, you're doing yourself a disservice. Looking at characters and looking at themes are like a great deal of the task, but someone who's going to take it further and someone who's going to get above that 6 and show complexity and sophistication is going to embed these literary devices consistently throughout their paragraphs. You're also going to compare the use of meta-language and literary devices in the contrast part. So if they both use an analogy, and we're going to cover that later, then obviously it's a similar use of literary device, but what's the difference in the intent? What's the authorial intent behind it? So please, guys, make sure you're doing this over the weekend. Listen to what I have to say, because everything that I'm saying isn't on the slides. Alright, so if you have to listen to it twice, please do. Take some notes. And I'm expecting that these literary devices covered today, and again, I'll reiterate that these aren't the only literary devices in there. I'm expecting you to know a little bit more, some of your prior knowledge to come through. I've just picked out a few that I think that are dominant in the text, that are a starting point for you guys. So first of all, I want to touch on this idea of religious allusions. Okay, so in Black Diggers, for example, religious, specifically Christian references are sprinkled throughout the play. So allusions are references to something, yeah? So consistent references to religion is something that's prevalent in both texts. So when we look at Black Diggers, specifically Christian references are sprinkled throughout the play. There is an understanding that most characters involved, like those that are Indigenous, Australian, European and British, are Christian and share a religious language and culture. We see most notably through the character of Archie his letters to his aunt that meditate on religious lessons that he has learned and reassure her that he has joined a Methodist Bible reading group. This changes, however. We see a shift in the way that he thinks when he writes his final letter. We see that he's lost his faith. He uses the quote from John as a way of explaining the darkness in which he finds himself. Now this idea of darkness and light we're going to touch on a little bit more later, and that's to do with symbols and motifs. Alright, the use of darkness, particularly in when we see the first chapter in Balland and Kerr, this idea of dark Australia, and we spoke how this highlights the racism, but what's the purpose of the light or the darkness in those stage directions? These are all things that you need to be thinking of, guys. So yeah, he explains the darkness in which he finds himself, but this is a contrast with Laurie. So Laurie, who we see last as an usher in a church where he is seeking sanctuary, reluctant to admit that he is in the lighthouse in Palestine, where he denies his fellow Christian that he wasn't in the war, and you have the wrong guy. Secretly, though, he is celebrating the fact that at least the war had allowed him to walk in the Holy Land. Now, if we can see here, this is this idea of Indigenous spirituality, that link not only to Indigenous culture, but that connection to land and sacred sites, which we see on page 5. Wright shows us how pervasive the influence of Christian missionaries was on Indigenous Australian communities. So this is this whole idea of context, guys. When we look at the stolen generation and how forced assimilation is something that Indigenous people had to overcome in a way. So Tommy and Bertie worry that Frank's soul will not know how to get home. So this idea of spirituality again, which is an ancient belief about the link to the land they were born in. But they say the Lord's Prayer over his body. So we see that, like, that the irony in that. as the only fitting ceremony they know. Right? And that's significant. The only fitting ceremony they know. So they don't know that their old ways. There is a good quote in there about, I don't know the old ways. I'm pretty sure that's roughly the quote. But they do know this idea of Christianity and burial and ceremony. Okay, and that highlights that contextual element of forced assimilation and a stolen culture. Similarly, the narrative uses the metaphor of Lazarus. Okay, so we see this idea of songs and hymns. So Lazarus rising from his tomb in page 61 and 64. Now I ask the question, so what is being alluded to through the reference to Lazarus? In the Bible, how was this act viewed? And how does that differ from what we see here? Alright, so if we turn to page 61, 64, give me a moment so I can get it up. So where does it say here? 61 to 64. So yeah, we see this idea of Lazarus rising from his tomb. Lazarus, Lazarus, come forth, Lazarus. The Lord is calling you, Lazarus. So this is talking about how, Tommy's rebirth. So he's rising from his death and overcoming his death. So it's a metaphor for that. So Laurie prays during Shellfire also, which is on page 29. So we start to see the purpose of prayer and religious and faith in the Black Diggers. So they both turn to prayer, Bertie and Laurie, for comfort, which Bertie turns to Christianity for comfort on page 45. We've spoken about Laurie at church, but also we see this idea of of dietary requirements to POWs. So the Indigenous soldiers acknowledging other faiths and trying to help them. So when they request, when they're in a prisoner of war camp, they, can you not serve pork to the Muslim people? And we've spoken about Indigenous spirituality. Now, when it comes to the longest memory, we see this. Religious illusions are also flooded. This is a time where Christianity prevailed. So we see this idea with Whitechapel that he references Judas, which is a religious illusion. Judas was said to have betrayed Jesus, and everyone else thinks that everyone at on the farm think that Whitechapel is in fact a traitor to his own son. Pardon me. We also see that God was used as a means of superiority and control. So on page 16 and 59, and again there's more references, but these are just the ones that I've come up with, that says that God was just and fair. So just and fair to justify the killing of Chapel. And white men in particular take comfort in using God to justify what they do. And then also we see these contradictions of religious values and slavery on page 111. If we flick to page 111 just quickly, I'm pretty sure that was, the Virginian. And he's talking about, is Christianity incapable with slavery? This is an old chestnut. The immediate answer is, of course it is not. Otherwise the 150-year-old practice of the latter would have driven the former from our midst. Slavery is a business. Christianity is a faith. Alright, that's a very complex idea, that the contradiction is separating faith and business. But one of the golden principles of Christianity and Catholicism is do unto others as they do to you, or very similar to that. And I think that was Matthew chapter 7 verse 12. It's a complex idea. But again, what is the purpose of the white man to use religion? Why is religion in this text? Okay, in one hand you've got the Black Diggers who, it's forced upon them. But also in the longest memory we see this idea that like there is a clear discrimination that God will favour the white man, and they use it so that slavery can still exist. Something that Mr. Whitechapel is quite complex or vexed about. So yeah, we have our religious illusions, but then we have our historical illusions. So references to history. So the slave trade, obviously it's very clear in the Virginian, but we also have the abolitionist movement, and Lydia is definitely much a symbol of that, or a motive for this movement. In the Black Diggers, you've got the Ballin and Kerr massacre. We've spoken about this. It's a true story, and we see this through the character of Nigel, and we've examined this scene. So when you are using these examples, make sure you're using these type of words like religious illusions and historical illusions, because you all know these scenes, but you need to start using the meta language to explain them. We also see, the World War I scenes, so references to the Western Front, and the Soldier Settlement Act, but also the eulogy at the tomb of the unknown soldier. So that the idea that the unknown soldier represents everyone. Okay, and like I've spoken about before, that idea of the stolen generation. It links to religious values and the assimilation of these religious values. A lot of these we've covered already, guys. So make sure if you're introducing them throughout your essay that you're using the buzzword. Pop it in there. The next thing that I wanted to look at is this idea. Where are we? Yeah, this idea of analogies. Okay, so an analogy is a comparison between one thing and another. So typically for the purpose of explanation or clarification. That is the literal definition for it. So in Black Diggers, Archie's letter, where he describes how Ollie Thomas's face was blown away off his own gun, and he wasn't screaming. He was just making these little sounds like a kitten. Alright, so that idea of like a kitten. So a kitten is like an infant. Yeah. So he was resorted back to the primitive behaviours of a human being. So the analogy of the Narrandera show. So page 40, the imagery of the showground examined childhood innocence and is followed by Bertie's blunt answer to his mother's question about what the grounds are. The show is over. Nothing. Nobody. It foreshadows both Bertie's loss of innocence when he begs to come home from the war and the shell-shocked state he is left in. So we see the Narrandera show on page 40. So Bertie's mum uses the analogy of the Narrandera show in an attempt to discourage Bertie from enlisting in World War I. So she reminds him of his childhood when he and his sister spent time watching the fancy circus while, quote, lounging on barbed wire like a pair of skin rats. So it was clearly evident that they could not enter because of their identity, which is what we're going to speak about next, which we should have spoken about on Friday, evident by their skin colour. She advises her son of the deceptive nature of the attraction and that he will always be prevented from becoming involved in white society. So this idea of the analogy to capture the illusory / deceptive nature of the dominant society and the acute level of oppression that Indigenous Australians suffer. And I'll show you what that looks like in a paragraph in a moment. But then we also see in the longest memory, so Whitechapel's memory of Chapel's death is filled with violent imagery. So the whip ate into him. It's also the personification of the whip too, if you want to go even further from imagery, until its mouth was so full that food seeped out of its corners to make room for more. And another analogy that we have was what began as a single thread has woven itself into a prodigious carpet that cannot be unwoven. This video is about to end, so I'm going to create one more, finishing off the rest of these slides, so stay with me.